Alright, y'all, so today I want to quickly discuss an interesting and lost and canceled version of Fantastic Four that we could have gotten on the big screen in the early 2000s that would have been directed by Peyton Reed, the guy who did all the MCU Ant-Man films. And it was best described as Hard Day's Night meet Fantastic Four. A very interesting and bold take on the Fantastic Four, and an idea that actually would influence the current day Marvel Studios take on Fantastic Four. I want to go into what this version of Fantastic Four could have been, what it contained, why it was canceled, and my overall thoughts on it. So just to give a little context and history behind this, Fox have been trying to develop a Fantastic Four film for a long time. They went through various directors and writers and scripts over the years, trying to get the film off the ground. At one point they had the Home Alone director attached, but that didn't work out. And then we come to Peyton Reed. Now, Peyton Reed was basically pitching his idea for a Fantastic Four film. In 2001, I believe, or 2002, he was kind of deep in production with one of his romantic comedies when he pitched Fox his idea for a Fantastic Four film. And Fox apparently liked it because then he worked with a writer called Doug Petrie. Now, what was his pitch and what was his idea? Well, like I said before, it was the Hard Day's Night meets Fantastic Four. This would have been a period film set in the 1960s, and it would have been kind of a day in the life of the Fantastic Four. We would have seen how these superheroes operated throughout a normal day and what their life really was like. The film also would have presented no origin story. It would have mainly just been a day in the life kind of story, with, I'm sure, parts of their origin being explained throughout the film. Other elements of this film also included the fact that the Fantastic Four were going to be treated like the Beatles. They're going to be like these very famous celebrities in New York City, and there would have been apparently at some point in the film, apparently how it would have opened, and at least in this version, they would have fought a giant monster that was coming off the ground around Fifth Avenue in New York City. Very similar to the monster that we see on the cover of Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four 1 and Stan Lee, the Giganto monster. And it just really would have shown how awesome this team was and how massive and celebrities they are. They basically just would have been the Beatles in their world, right? And then we've also seen more of their family life, as the Doug Petrie, the writer, and Peyton Reed would later explain in later years. We would have seen a side of them that, besides the monster fighting, we have also seen the day in the life of how they operate at home. We would have seen them argue over many petty things, as a family usually does, right? They would have been arguing over pizzas. They would have been arguing which costume looks better during a fight, and just so on and so on. We would have really gotten a sense in the family unit of the Fantastic Four in this film, which is always great, right? This is Marvel's first family. Now, for their idea of Doctor Doom, well, they mentioned that Doctor Doom was going to be treated, how the Fantastic Four are basically going to be treated as the Beatles. Dr. Doom was going to be treated as the Pete Best, basically the Beatles member that got kicked out early in their career, right? Dr. Doom, who would have been, in their origin story, like in most continuities, but instead of gaining miraculous superpowers, instead would have been horrifically disfigured thanks to the whole disaster, right? He would have had to wear a suit and a mask, basically to keep his insides and his bodily functions together. And in this version, he also would have been from Latveria as well, and just been very upset and jealous of the Fantastic Four, right? Kind of treated, like I said, symbolically as like a rejected member of the Beatles, Pete Best. There also been, like I said, more of a horrifying body horror element to this version of Fantastic Four, Dr. Doom, where there was a part apparently in this pitch where he would remove his mask. It would come off and on like a technological high-tech thing. And when you remove his mask, you would slowly start to see his body sag and decompose in the inside, right? A very creepy and weird element to Dr. Doom. So it's something that he would definitely have to wear his mask and his armor all the time just to keep his bodily form together. A very interesting and bizarre body horror take on Dr. Doom. And beyond these initial details, this is basically all we know from the pitch in this 1960s Hard Day's Night version of Fantastic Four. It would have been very interesting, and like I said, overall, I think it sounds really great. I like the fact that it's a period piece. I like the fact that it's kind of like a mockumentary day in the life of these famous superhero celebrities in the 1960s. Especially since Jack Kirby and the Fantastic Four came from the 60s. I feel like, to be honest with you, in most continuities, they feel the best in their own 60s time, right? They feel like characters straight from the 60s, so why not put them in the 60s, right? I think it sounds great, and I think it's a very interesting and unique take on the Fantastic Four. Now, there was another version of this film that was worked on by Doug Petrie and Peyton Reed at some point. It actually wasn't necessarily the 1960s pitch, more of a modern day take on it, but a lot of elements that would eventually be in the Hard Day's Night pitch are also here. Now, like I said, it's kind of unclear whether that version or this version would have been made. I would assume the 1960s version is usually the one that they bring up the most, so I think that one would have been the one they would have pursued with. But I still wanted to mention this version, as there's a lot of parallels to 2005 film. For example, in this script, this version of the movie, it would have started with a robbery of like a Brinks armored truck in New York City. And we get to see the Fantastic Four stop the robbery. We get to see them all demonstrate their powers in very creative and interesting ways. There also would have been elements to it, still very similar to Hard Day's Night. Like I said, showing that day in the life of superheroes. After that, then we would have returned to the Baxter Building, and we would have seen the family dynamic at play. We would have seen the Fantastic Four bicker among each other. There's a really funny scene where like a pizza delivery guy would have like tried to like snap a secret photo of their equipment and the four, and then Sue would have found them and basically kicked out the pizza delivery guy. A really funny little part of the script. And at some point, we've also would have gotten more of their backstory. Reed is apparently working on a machine, a chamber machine that would have contained cosmic and particle waves, basically an attempt to kind of reverse the effects of what happened to them and how the group got their powers, right? And this would have led into a flashback. So in this version, it would have been a flashback that would have explained their origin, but the film would have started out with all these characters having their powers already. Now, basically before, like I said, all four of them, including Victor, Dr. Doom, are heading off into a mission basically to study particle waves and the cosmic rays in the universe, in the hope that basically they can replace, with this source of energy, fossil fuels and stuff. Now, Victor, aka Dr. Doom in this script, is described as being like a playboy prince of Latveria. Now, in this version, his queries from Latveria, he's more of a playboy, rash, very arrogant kind of guy, right? And Victor and Reed kind of fight in this flashback how to proceed with the mission. And eventually, there's like a cosmic storm that approaches. Now, Reed obviously wants to do the sensible thing and avoid it. But Victor wants to fly through the storm. Like I said, insisting to see what the effects are going to be. And basically, they get into a fight in 0G. Victor gets kicked off the ship in an escape pod, and the storm hits the ship, affecting all four of the Fantastic Four. Now, as I said before, the cosmic storm, as it hits the ship, the resulting effects actually do hit the escape pod Victor's in, but on the opposite effect, right? He actually gets burned and severely injured and disconfigured thanks to the effects of the cosmic storm. And we go back to the present day in the script. We see Latveria, where Dr. Doom here basically overthrows the constitutional government and basically becomes a dictator in this script. And similar to the comics, but there would have been an element similar to the pitch where the armor is holding Victor himself. There's a part apparently in the script where Doom removes his mask for some boy in Latveria just to see what he looks like. And initially he sees some kind of face, but it starts to sag and decompose, once again adding to that body horror element to this script. Like I said, a very interesting thing. He has to wear his armor in order to keep everything inside. And of course, as a result, freaks out this boy. Now, meanwhile, Reed kind of works on this chamber, trying to harness the power of cosmic and particle rays, and like I said, an effort to remove their powers for good. Very similar to the 2005 movie, really. And there's kind of a weird element to this version as well. The government are kind of watching them, and the building that the Fantastic Four are in are actually run by some weird landlord who's demanding rent money. Very weird and funny part of it. At some point in the story, Victor apparently tries to go in public as Doctor Doom, accusing the Four of like manipulating things, and urges the other members to leave Reed's group, right? The Fantastic Four. There's kind of some controversy here, and eventually the Fantastic Four do disband. Um, and then there's also a weird part in this script, similar to the 2005 film. Ben would have been manipulated by Doctor Doom to basically not become the Thing, to try out that chamber. And he does here, and he does become human, though, like in this version, apparently not like the movie version, he just sort of transforms back into the Thing again. It's not like a situation where he has to go back into the chamber and transform himself back. It's more of just, it's kind of an irreplaceable effect, a condition, right? It can't be fixed right now. He just slowly transforms back, which, like I said, adding more to the body horror element. I think that really sounds great for a Fantastic Four film. Now, at some point, after all this controversy, the four of them would have reunited and eventually would have fought Doom in a much more epic climax compared to the final film we got in 2005. And that was kind of more or less this version of Peter's script, and what Pete and Reed could have done. A more modern day take, but still overall a honestly better version of the 2005 film, right? Reed seems more interesting. He's also more older in this script. Unlike the 2005 film, I think he's like in his 40s here, which is like pretty interesting. Sue Storm's in her 20s here, which I feel like it's kind of one of those things, like it's from the comics, but it's also pretty strange. You can definitely have some weird dynamics there, but obviously it's not pulling out in the script. From what people have said about this script, Reed's pretty good. Sue is a very strong and core character to the movie, very confident, and she's really like the brick that holds the whole team together, right? Which is great. Johnny here, too, has more development. He even does the little flame-on thing and uses his powers throughout the script. There's a part in this story, apparently, where people have said that, apparently he was trying to steal a girl away from this guy's a girl basically away from this boyfriend that she has. And the boyfriend catches her kind of cheating with Johnny, and then the boyfriend basically says, "You could use your powers for something better than all this." And kind of like more of a character development for Johnny, realizing, oh, maybe I can use these powers for something better. Like I said, more character development for Johnny. That wasn't really in the final film in 2005. Like I said, really great stuff. And Ben here in this version has more of a deeper arc compared to the 2005 film, which, like I said, the arc in that film is also really good. But like I mentioned, when he gets transformed back into human, he goes, like I said, progressively goes back into the Thing. Really interesting, weird part of the movie. But I think overall it's a pretty great moment. There's also a moment in the story where Sue attempts to confront Ben and comfort him. And he basically in response says to Sue, "Ben is dead. I'm just a thing." A really tragic line. There's also other characters in the script that reject Ben until he finds Alicia, the blind girlfriend and person that he would eventually marry, especially in future comics and stuff. And like I said, there's other versions of this script. The action scenes, there's not really too many in this version, but it's been described that Thing apparently would have fought some gang members at some point in the script, some kind of New York street gang. And of course, there would have been the epic fight at the end against Doom. So yeah, that's pretty much this version of the movie. More of a modern day take on it, but still overall, while like I said, it's similar in some ways to the 2005 film, I think overall was an improvement overall in quality compared to the 2005 film. There's deeper character moments here, deeper arcs. Doom is a better, more sinister villain here. I love the elements of body horror in this script. And in general, just a more straightforward, less origin nonsense, right? We don't have to wait a whole hour just to get the team together. In this script, they're already together. They really only have one flashback that kind of explains their origin, and that's it. I like that. I like when films don't waste my time. Other than that, pretty great version. Now, what ultimately happened to this version and the Hard Day's Night pitch from Peyton Reed and Doug Petrie? Well, they worked on the film for roughly about a year. And
in terms of
basically, Fox was not really coming in terms of Peyton Reed's vision. They weren't really seeing eye to eye. Fox was seeing Fantastic Four as more of a B movie,
they obviously did the
something that they don't really need to pour significant resources into. They really didn't put it as a priority compared to their X-Men films, right? And eventually, it kind of came to a head.
The writer
Eventually, they couldn't come together on a budget. They couldn't really even come together on a full vision. It seemed like Fox didn't really like the 60s pitch that Reed did, and even though they did a modern-day take later on, it seems like they didn't really like that version too either. They weren't really coming together on a creative level and on a financial level especially. So eventually, Peyton Reed and the writer attached as well just parted ways from the project.
Other than that,
and that officially scrapped Peyton Reed's version of Fantastic Four. Ultimately, after this, Fox, in terms of Fantastic Four and the rights, they had to come together with something, right? And in all these scripts together, and I believe they hired another writer to rewrite the script into something more manageable. And eventually, they saw an early cut of Taxi, and eventually hired Tim Story, who was kind of also a big fan of the comics, but very inexperienced as a director. And in my opinion, didn't really have as much of a creative pitch compared to something like Fantastic Four. That being said, didn't really have a creative pitch compared to what Peyton Reed was trying to do with the Hard Day's Night Fantastic Four pitch, or even the modern day script they were trying to do. But that being said, Fantastic Four, we eventually, Tim Story would jump on, and eventually in 2005, we would get the film that we eventually got, and for better for worse. I still think it's a pretty decent movie. Maybe the best Fantastic Four film to this date. At the time of making this video, I haven't really seen the new one yet, but, overall pretty decent. Now, my quick thoughts on this version of Fantastic Four from Peyton Reed. I think overall this was really a shame. Reading about what this pitch was and what the modern day pitch was, there's a lot of elements to this script that obviously made it to the final film in 2005. You have the chamber. You still have the part where Ben goes back into becoming a human. You also have Dr. Doom trying to manipulate the Four into breaking up, which kind of happens in the script. But I think overall in both versions, and even the Hard Day's Night pitch, the film is just better structured, and there's more deeper character moments, right? There's elements to this movie that I think just work even better. And there's just definitely elements to this script that I think, and version, I think that just work, like I said, even better. I think that the Hard Day's Night pitch with the 60s and them being a day in a life kind of thing was really cool. It's a very radical and different take on the Fantastic Four, but I think the Fantastic Four fits the best in the 60s, to be honest. And I think this having this day in the life approach, and that the Fantastic Four are basically celebrities, they're basically the Beatles, right? There's heavy Beatles influence here. I really enjoy this take on the Fantastic Four. It would have been very interesting, and even the modern day take had a lot of really cool and great and deep character moments. So overall, I think it's a bit of a shame we never got to see Peyton Reed's Fantastic Four. I think it would have been a better film than the 2005 film. Just kind of a tragic thing he never got the chance to direct it. In terms of the aftermath, Peyton Reed obviously would go on to make the 3 Ant-Man MCU films, and eventually, he would actually incorporate some of his ideas from the Hard Day's Night pitch and the Fantastic Four film he was developing into apparently Quantum Mania and other Ant-Man films, which I think is always a good thing to see. I think that, it's really great that he got to incorporate some of his other ideas, from other pitches, right? I think it's always great. And of course, we eventually got the film that we got from Marvel Studios, which, like I said, I do think that it takes a lot of heavy influence from what Peyton Reed was trying to do all the way back in the early 2000s, which I think is always a good thing. So yeah, overall, that was my quick and really quick thoughts on Peyton Reed's Fantastic Four and what could have been. Overall, you like this video, comment, subscribe, and peace. Have a nice day, y'all.